All right, guys, welcome back to the Guilty as Charged podcast. So happy to be joined again by Ben Fennell, who joined us early on in this draft process to talk about the Senior Bowl. He's back today. Ben, how you doing today, man?
I'm doing well. We're sitting here under 2 weeks away from the first round of the NFL draft, down the home stretch. A lot of smoke and mirrors this time of year.
Yes.
Really fun to kind of keep peeling back those layers of the onion and dive into these players.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned the smoke thing. Where do you land on this Mac Jones thing, real quick? I didn't tell you beforehand that we were going to talk about this, but where do you land on Mac Jones potentially being considered with the 49ers and that kind of smoke screen that's going on these days?
Well, I think there's going to be a lot of chatter with where these quarterbacks are going to land, and obviously scheme fit is very important. I think there's going to be 5 quarterbacks gone in the top 10, and I would not be shocked to see them go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now, the narrative
Wow.
is whoever goes 5 has been slighted and has been overlooked and has been counted out. And I don't agree with that. I think they're all very good prospects. They're all going in the first area of the first round. They all have ability. Now let's see how they're used and what scheme they go into. And I'm not the one that's going to be dramatic if one goes over the other. And, I remember a prospect a couple of years ago that said, I'm going to make everyone that overlooked me regret it.
Oh,
And I
yeah.
think that was Denzel Ward. He went 4th overall. So that's kind of what it feels
Yeah.
like, this kind of slight in conversation. So now you're just trying to figure out the right scheme, the right fit, the right style. You could watch every snap of these kids' career, but you have to know who you're getting as well. And that teammate,
Yeah.
the employee, the coworker, the leader, all that other stuff that you can't figure out on the tape. So that's what the pro day circuit's about. That's what this time of year is about, and trying to peel back all those layers to who this player and who this person is.
Well, I think a lot of, fans in general just kind of undervalue the developmental aspect of things. It's like, the Saints, it seems like the Saints and the Packers are always drafting in like the 20s and 30s, but they're always getting good players because they develop them well. And I think that has kind of been something that goes by the wayside.
Well,
So,
it's also like there's dangerous precedents out there for early immediate success.
yeah.
And that becomes the model. So every team then says, well, why isn't our guy having the immediate success?
Yep.
You also have to put a human element to it. These are 20 to
Yeah.
25-year-old young, developing adults, young professionals. Could there be a more turbulent time in their lives? Some guys don't always get off of the right foot in the professional sector. Some guys do. Some need a year, 2 years, 3 years, maybe 4 years, maybe their second team, maybe a new coach, maybe a new voice. It doesn't always happen the same way. But I think those case studies of immediate success really taint the kind of collective process
Yeah.
of development, because everybody thinks that that's what it should look like. And we're just so impatient. We want to either crown them or rip them down as soon as we can. A little patience goes a long way.
Yeah, specifically the Chargers have been kind of obviously blessed, but also kind of cursed in that regard because Joey Bosa was Defensive Rookie of the Year. Derwin James was an All-Pro. Obviously, Justin Herbert now comes in and is just this amazing quarterback, despite.
Well, you guys are showing the dangerous precedent to the
Yeah,
league
exactly.
of saying early success. When you draft them, you're going to get results year one.
Yeah.
So everybody's looking at that. Well, if we take a safety in round one, you better be an all-pro like Derwin James.
Yeah, exactly. So just a cautionary tale, lower expectations sometimes. I want to get back to the pro day conversation because obviously there's no combine this year. It seems like every single receiver in the draft is running a 4.3 this year. When you look at a prospect and they either test, out of their minds or they test really poorly, like how do you as a scout value these testing scores? If you're looking at a player like a James Hudson, who looks athletic on tape, but then he goes out and he doesn't have a great pro day, how do you kind of wade through that process of evaluating that prospect after the pro day?
To me, the combine on-field workout and the pro day are about 5% of the puzzle of a prospect. And it's important to know that this time of year is when the pro days and the workouts are going on. It's what's in our face. We don't have games to watch. We don't have film to watch, new film. So this is the narrative at the moment. So there's a lot of buzz and talk and discussion about it, which is just the arc for conversations. A lot of people are wondering, why is there so much conversation about pro days? There are every year. Now, we just didn't have a combine, so these workouts are becoming that much more heightened and discussed. But it's important to remember the pro day workouts and the results are not your conclusion of the evaluation. And a lot of times you see these results in the metrics and say, that's the report. That's who he is. They're a cross-checking tool that if a player maybe looked questionable speed on tape, and then you see the questionable speed at the pro day, now you're connecting dots. If you saw a player not struggle with speed on tape and then not test particularly well, there's a disconnect and you want to go back and look. So a lot of times these pro day workouts are cross-checking tools to either confirm or maybe recheck an area of concern. But it's always important to remember, these are not the conclusion. And too often we're seeing well, he tested really well, this is who he is. It's still a piece of the puzzle. And one workout in shorts and a t-shirt on a sunny afternoon doesn't overrule 2,500 snaps on the field. And there's way too much of what's in your face right now outweighing everything they did up to this point. And their film will always be their football DNA. That's who they are as a player. Now, everybody has interesting scenarios and injuries and on-field time, off-field time, position switches, scheme fits. That's what these pro days are about, trying to maybe find some areas that you didn't get to see on tape. But again, this cycle is so strange because of the opt-outs. You had players that didn't play this year. You had some guys not play for 2 years, like a Walker Little. You have guys that played essentially for 1 year in college. So there's a lot of gray area and kind of smoke and fog with this particular process. It's very unique.
I love the way that you said that it's all about cross-checking and kind of making sure the dots connect. So the other thing that I think, comes out of these pro days, and it happens every single year, right, with the offensive tackle position. And while so-and-so has short arms, he now has to switch to guard, or so-and-so has long arms and maybe he has to kick out to tackle. The Chargers had their recent press conference and Brandon Staley kind of like casually mentioned like, oh, like having length at the tackle position is important. That doesn't necessarily mean like we're looking for 34-inch arms, but how much does length actually value and mean for these offensive tackle positions? Because you've got a guy like Liam Eichenberg who measured, with 32-inch arms, and Brady Christensen with 32-inch arms. So how much does length matter for these guys when they move to the NFL?
But it's still part of the puzzle, their metrics, their measurables, in combination with their on-field play and ability. I could find you guys with the longest arms in the 98th percentile that are going to be first-round picks for Enterprise Rent-A-Car because they have horrible technique and they don't know how to use that functional length. And I could find guys that are under the threshold of arms that are sitting in the Hall of Fame comfortably. So it's all in combination with how you use that length or not use that length. If you're technically sound, the length doesn't always matter. Sometimes those length and those measurables make up for the lapses in other areas. So maybe you have a technique flaw and your length helps you recover. Or maybe you have a slow foot and your length helps you survive with the lack of athleticism. So it's all in combination. But again, I'm not one that just says, does he meet our measurable thresholds? No, because it's how they're using those measurables, how they're using it in combination with their on-field play. So there's ones that maybe have the short arms and aren't technically sound. There's going to be some issues there, obviously. And there's too many, obviously, red flags there. And those are the guys that are maybe fits to slide inside and help protect those deficiencies.
That's great stuff, man. Great stuff. So last
You're
time
not going to get any emotional reactions out of me. I'm very tempered in everything I kind of think about. I never try to ride the wave of evaluation and the discussion of prospects. There's too much sensationalism with these guys. And it's fun to talk about. It's fun to be dramatic. It's fun to be emotional. It's also fun to be calm and tempered in how we're talking about them too.
Absolutely agree. I couldn't agree more there. So last time we talked a lot about offensive prospects. Today we're going to talk about some defensive prospects. I think one of the recent developments that kind of shook up the board is Caleb Farley's second back surgery. How do you think teams will react to that? And do you think he'll fall? Do you think he could still be, under consideration to be the first cornerback off the board? What do you make of his situation this year?
Well, it seems like Surtain and J.C. Horn have comfortably kind of separated themselves as Farley was in that mix for a while of potentially being the first corner. Teams are concerned because he had a torn ACL coming out of high school. He was also a quarterback receiver going to Virginia Tech, converted to corner at Virginia Tech. So he's still a little raw toolsy wise and technique wise, but he has some amazing God-given abilities. He is explosive. He has track speed. He's big. He's tall. He's long. He's fast. Sometimes he'll take 3 steps in coverage and say, screw it. I'm just going to figure it out and use my raw athleticism to get the job done. And a lot of times you could win that way in college. You can't always win that way in the pros. So in combination with his rawness as a cornerback prospect and the injuries, not just the back, but the knee as well, which you always want to make sure those knees are good at cornerbacks, especially if you're a little bit bow-legged with those knees flaring out. So there's just some concern about his rawness, his ability to be ready in year one and be ready for training camp and preseason. There might be a rumored redshirt year just to shut him down completely, get him completely healthy. That doesn't mean he can't be a coveted prospect, as we've seen, Jeffrey Simmons go to the Titans as an injured prospect. We've seen Sidney Jones go early second round to the Eagles as an injured prospect. Jalen Smith from Notre Dame, injured prospect, early second round. So I think somewhere between 25 and 40 is going to be the right ballpark for Caleb Farley.
Yeah, it's going to be so fascinating to see, where he goes, because there are a lot of teams right in the teens right after the Chargers that do need a cornerback. So that's going to be interesting to see where he comes off the board. How do you see this second tier of the cornerbacks? You mentioned that it kind of seems like Patrick Surtain and JC Horn have separated themselves. You've talked a lot about on your Twitter timeline about Greg Newsome and obviously, Paulson Adebo, Eric Stokes, Tyson Campbell, Asante Samuel Jr. How do you see this second tier of cornerbacks stacking up this year?
Well, Stephen, we get so enamored with the height, weight, speed press corners this time of year. And those are the ones that get bumped to the top and the cream rises to the top, obviously. There's a lot of teams playing zone coverage in the NFL.
Yeah.
And it's some of my favorite defenses and some of the best defenses, whether it was Indy or the Rams or the Packers or the Colts, or the Bills, or the Bucks play a lot of zone. The Steelers play a lot of zone. It's a very safe defense. I kind of think man coverage is a little bit broken right now. And if you saw Nick Saban talking about the clinics the past couple of weeks and how he doesn't really know how to stop these offenses anymore, it really kind of confirms that. But anyways, so JC Horn, Farley, Surtain, the big height, weight, speed press corners. There's a lot of good zone corners in this class. You just ran off a bunch of them. Asante Samuel Jr., Tyson Campbell, Paulson Adebo, Greg Newsome, Fatu Melifonwu, I think would be a really good zone corner. These are guys that maybe don't have the smooth hips to transition, a little clunky finding the ball down the field, maybe a technique flaw, but they have really good size, really good play temperament, really good tackling ability and physicality. They're guys that maybe you just don't want always running down the field, or maybe they have some size limitations, like Asante Samuel Jr. at 5'10", 185 pounds. Yeah, he's going to get beasted by some 6'4" gazelle receivers that are all over the NFL, and he faced more than a few of them in the ACC. So, excuse me, this next tier of corners, I think, is a really good group, but it somehow knocks them by calling them a zone corner.
Yeah.
But I think there's a great value for this type of corner in the league. It's becoming more popular, and these guys are just as valuable as the press man corners, in my opinion.
Yeah, that's a great conversation. And I think the Chargers, obviously, they could go corner in the first round. They could go corner in the second round. And I think this class in general, like you said, has just been kind of undervalued. So under Brandon Staley, he's kind of talked about it. They're going to be very multiple in their coverage schemes. They do play some quarters, they play some man. Who are some kind of late round cornerbacks that you think could come in and develop into a versatile corner prospect that can do a little bit of everything for a team like the Chargers?
Well, I think they're still going to be kind of zone based, probably play a little bit more zone than the Chargers had the past couple years. Just trying to replicate his Rams defense, very quarters based, very stressful on the safety positions as they have to key the run and also be back end players and cut crossers and run with tight ends. Very stressful on that safety position. But some late round corners I think are interesting. Maybe a Marco Wilson out of Florida, who's a big, tall, long press corner that's played 2,000 snaps in the SEC. Was just very clunky after that freshman year, after 2017, I believe. If you just looked at his freshman tape, he's a first round pick, but then they moved him to nickel and moved him to safety, and just not technically sound, but a really interesting height, weight, speed player that showed up at his pro day with all sorts of 99th percentile metrics in the vertical, the broad, the bench press. Really interesting player there. I really think these Georgia defensive backs are going to be great pros, whether it's Tyson Campbell, like we talked about. Eric Stokes is more of the press man guy. It's probably going to go in round 2 at the 4.2 speed. But DJ Daniel is a tough SOB corner out there. He's a no nonsense guy. He's kind of a hybrid of the two of them that I think would be a great fit. Maybe slide him into nickel for that cornerback position there. But yeah, it's an interesting class. There's some really big corners as well, whether it's Keith Taylor at Washington, who's 6'2", but Benjamin St. Juice at Minnesota, who's 6'3", 200 pounds, fast, long. I think these are the new types of corners where I want guys that can engulf receivers and will tackle and really disrupt with those long limbs. I don't necessarily need the twitchy guys with all these zone coverages. I need guys with the physicality, the shoulders, the kind of, hold up in the run game, hold up with all that perimeter action, and just be able to disrupt and get their hands on some balls. So some of these really big corners, I think, would be good fits.
Yeah, that's funny because we had Brentley Weissman of the Draft Network on a couple weeks ago, and he also mentioned Benjamin St. Juice. So seems like that is definitely someone that Chargers fans should keep an eye on. I'm glad that you mentioned the safety position because, I've kind of felt for the last few weeks that, everybody, in terms of Chargers fans kind of pegs them as a team that's going to take a cornerback early. But, I could see them taking one of these safeties in the second round. And like you said, this defense puts so much stress on them. Do you think this safety class, in terms of like the top, is it Trayvon Merrick and Richie Grant and everybody else, or do you think that there's somebody else that could, sneak in there and be, a top safety off the board too?
Yeah, it seems like Trayvon Marag is going to be the first round safety. I call Jeremiah Owusu-Koramoah a safety, a big nickel, but obviously a different type of prospect.
Hey, I do too, man. I don't understand that thing that he's going to be like an inside linebacker. I think he's a safety, but
me too. And I like to categorize these players as city players or country players.
Okay.
City players, tight spaces in the box. You want to mix it up in the phone booth. Country players, you want out in space. You want out there in the perimeter and be able to use that athleticism. I think JOK is a country player. I want to use his athleticism to cover ground, work to the sideline. The second you get him in confined spaces and have to take on guards, he's suddenly not so athletic. Suddenly you have to look at the sand in the pants and to see, oh, he's 215. We really need him to be 225. And then you lose a step. And I want him to be that big nickel, which is taking over the NFL. The small cornerback, that small nickel is really a dying breed because they're just getting picked on in the run game, getting picked on with perimeter receiver action. I think he'd be a great fit to be somebody's big nickel out there in the slot so you could blitz them and run support and all that stuff. But the safety group is really interesting. I don't know if it's super top heavy, but there's some great prospects right in like the meat of the draft and all in the kind of day 2, round 3 ballpark, whether you mentioned Richie Grant, Talanoa Hufanga is a really good player at USC. If the medicals check out, Jacoby Stevens, LSU, had a great year in 2018-19. LSU collectively didn't look great in 2020. Yeah. He's like a day 3 version of Jeremiah Owusu-Koramoah, in my opinion. He played all over the field. He's explosive, very athletic. He's a playmaker at all 3 levels. Divine Diablo. Whew. If you want a clone of like a Derwin James in this draft, it's got to be Diablo at 6'3", 225, former 4-star receiver, great athleticism, great special teams. If you want a cover 4 quarter safety that can come down and essentially hit like a linebacker, but has the savviness to play backwards and the ball skills, that's a Divine Diablo. But you better get him quick because there's a lot of teams playing more quarters these days, and they're going to want a Divine Diablo to pair in their safety group. But if you look at Brandon Staley coming from the Rams, he survived last year with Troy Reeder and Micah Kaiser at linebacker. Those safeties behind him were incredible, and John Johnson and Jordan Fuller. So in projecting forward to the Chargers, you better have 2 dogs at safety back there.
That's a great point. That is a great point. And I'm really glad you mentioned Divine Diablo because I think he is definitely one of the players that's been a little, slept on, as they say. So I'm glad you mentioned the special teams as well. It's a huge need for the Chargers. They were one of the worst units in probably, the last decade last year. Who are some of your favorite special teams players in this draft that maybe we could see come off of day 3 and make a good impact in that regard for the Chargers and other teams as well?
Oh man, it's middle of April and we got a guy focusing on special teams. Nobody cares about special teams until our punt coverage, gives up a touchdown or we get a punt blocked and everybody's saying, what about our special teams? But I love putting value on special teams because that makes their floor that much higher. It makes them that much safer of a prospect and that you can get production elsewhere. So Divine Diablo is the leader in the clubhouse on my board with 739 career special team snaps all over the place. I used to think 500 was a big threshold, but this group, there's been a bunch that have raised that. So Justin Hilliard, Ohio State, hasn't played a whole lot. Linebacker, he was kind of buried on the depth chart, had some injuries. He contributed wherever he could. He's a 700 plus special teamer. Trey Brown at Oklahoma, kind of an undersized corner at like 5'9", probably going to move to nickel in the NFL. Another guy, 700 plus special teams. Have you watched Avery Williams at Boise State? I cannot believe
It's electric, man.
He wasn't on the combine invite list. He'll be my first pick of non-combine guys to get drafted. I know people are saying there was no combine, but there was an invite list handed out by the NFL. He was not on it, despite being a special team stalwart. He's a guy that said, I want to be Matthew Slater, which is pretty sick of a college player to have that kind of projection and thought. But 8 return touchdowns as a returner, 3 block kicks, great corner, great safety, great nickel. He's a guy that I think is going to just make somebody's team better. And a bunch of athletic linebackers around there, whether it's Garrett Wallow at TCU, Buddy Johnson at Texas A&M, teams that maybe didn't have the great team success, but they have a lot of athleticism in their own kind of package in a vacuum. So these are some guys that maybe aren't day one starters, but they're going to show up and be a 4-core special teamer with a smile on their face. And maybe that doesn't make highlights on SportsCenter, and they're not going to get a lot of conversation in the summer at training camp. But these are the ones that really make or break games and kind of fill out the back end of your roster. It's not always who the best guys are. Sometimes it's who the worst guys are. Who's that back end and what are they doing for your team? So these are the guys you want to definitely fill out your roster with.
Yeah, it's funny because if the Chargers were even just like below average, I don't think we'd be having that conversation. But I don't know if you happen to ever watch the Patriots game from this past year, and it wasn't even
Chargers special team stigma going back from my days where I worked on the show Playbook and NFL Network for a couple of years. There was a season, I think you guys went through 5 or 6 long snappers.
It wouldn't surprise me.
You just had a weird run on injuries of long snappers, and there was all sorts of bad snaps and block punts that season. And I remember studying the punters of the Chargers to see how many steps they were taking on their drops, to see are they taking too many steps into the punt block. And anyways, long story short, I have this weird stigma of Chargers being a bad special teams group.
Well, it's definitely been a big issue. That probably was that same year where they went 8-8, even though they had the best offense and best defense in the league. So it's been an issue forever. But thankfully, it seems like this group finally has, they're going to put the proper emphasis on it. So
I might have a couple of Dante Hall flashes too from the early 2000s, and him carving up the special teams coverage.
Oh yeah, always. But he did that to everybody, to be fair. So we'll get you out of here on this. This has been fantastic. Who are some of your late day 2, early day 3 sleepers, regardless of position, doesn't have to be defense, that you think are going to come in and outkick their coverage, be very productive NFL players despite being not a top 50 selection?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I would pound the table for any of these BYU offensive linemen. Zach Wilson stole all the thunder with his right arm and the playmaking ability. This was a run-first offense with a dominant, nasty offensive line. I love Brady Christensen at left tackle. I think their right guard, Tristan Hodge, is a good player. I think their right tackle, Chandon Herring, is a good player. I don't know where any of them get drafted. I have a tough time finding a spot for Brady Christensen with this deep tackle group. It seems like people like the Samuel Cosmes and Liam Eichenberg's a little bit better than him. So he might be a 3rd-round pick. He might be an early day 3 guy that I think is a day 1 starter for his own scheme team. There's also a lot of interesting kind of weapons out there. It's a deep slot. I call them slot backs. They're guys that are essentially slot receivers, but essentially you just want the ball in their hands.
Yeah.
Whether they just want to call them a returning threat or a yards after catch threat, a screen threat. But we know the top guys in Rondale Moore, Elijah Moore, and, Kadarius Toney. But guys like Amir Smith-Marset at Iowa, I think is just as good, just without the production. I mean, they had Nate Stanley throwing them for a couple of years. So he had a little bit of quarterback issues. Yeah. Their past 2 years, they said, you know what? Just come run a jet sweep and we're just going to hand you the ball if we can't get it to you in the pass game. And he was a prolific player with the ball in his hands. Reminded me a lot of Ted Ginn. If he was at Ohio State or a big program, I think we're talking about a top 50 player. And there's guys like this all over the draft, whether it's, D. Eskridge at Western Michigan, who was able to show off a little bit, I think, down at the Senior Bowl. He's a guy with 4.3 speed for days. So there's a lot of guys like that I just see so much in the meat of the draft that round 3, 4, 5, day one starters, contributors, role players, guys you could get on-field production from essentially in year one, in my opinion, if all goes right. I just see a lot of guys that have some ability to contribute right away, right in that meat of the draft. So if you're a team at the back end of round one, maybe like a Saints, a Packers, maybe even the Chargers, to stockpile some more day two picks. A lot of teams are kind of going that direction. So it might not be a bad strategy to sub out that pick in the 20s for maybe another second round pick or a third round pick.
Absolutely. I think this is a very deep and talented offensive class. We'll see about the defense, but I think, there are some really good prospects at positions of need for the Chargers. So Ben, this has been so awesome, man. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us. And we look forward to seeing your coverage over the next couple of weeks.
Yeah, it's an exciting time down the home stretch. And then, of course, on to 2022, which is going to be a wild class with all these returnees to college. But we'll save that for another show.
Absolutely, Ben. Thank you so much.
Take care.